The sun hung low in the late autumn sky, casting long, golden streaks across the open plains, where the grass had turned brittle with the first breath of winter. Dust rose in slow spirals behind a weather-worn wagon trundling along a dirt road that split the Kansas frontier like a scar. It was the kind of cold that crept in quiet and stayed beneath the skin, a reminder that another hard season was settling in. James Carroll held the reins with a steady hand, though his shoulders were tight with weariness. His hat-shaded blue eyes that hadn't softened in years, not since war had hollowed out the best parts of him and left only the necessary pieces behind. The wagon carried supplies, flour, kerosene, cloth, and more importantly, a child wrapped in a wool blanket sleeping against a pile of sacks. Her name was Willa. She was 7, and she was all he had left of his sister. After the fever took her, James rode 3 days to bring the girl back from the outskirts of Dodge. She hadn't spoken since. She watched him with wary eyes, as though unsure of where she now stood in the world, or if she belonged in it at all. He hadn't the heart nor the skill to know how to comfort her, and he cursed that fact in silence. The town of Abilene stood small against the rising wind, no longer the roaring cattle hub it once was, but still clinging to life through mercantile trade and the grit of those who refused to leave. James's homestead sat a mile beyond it, framed by wind-twisted cottonwoods and the remains of a once-thriving apple orchard. The house was sturdy, if plain, and too quiet for a child who'd lost her world. He needed someone, not a nanny or a handmaid, but a woman of sense and strength who could tend to the needs of a young girl and maybe bring a measure of warmth back to his land. It wasn't love he was after. He'd long given up on that. He needed a mother for Willa. In town, the saloon door creaked as James stepped inside, the way a man does when he carries more burden than appetite. He met the gaze of Sheriff Dugan, who sat nursing a pipe in the corner. They exchanged nods, the sheriff's eyes flicking to the wanted poster fluttering beside the door. Nothing new. "I hear you're looking to hire help," Dugan said, voice gruff but not unkind. "I need a woman who's good with children," James replied. "One who won't spook at the quiet." "You lookin' to pay or to marry?" James's jaw worked for a second. "I ain't got time to court. I need someone who's willin' to build a home where one's been hollowed out." Dugan studied him. "There's a woman passed through last week, stayed at Widow Harrow for a spell. Quiet thing, but she chopped wood like she was born to it. Said she was headin' west, but her eyes didn't look fixed on anything. Might still be round." "What's her name?" Clara Green, I think it was." James left the saloon with a name and a thread of hope in his chest. Not the loud kind, but the sort that flickers low and steady. He found Widow Harrow's house easy enough, a squat little thing with lace curtains and the scent of lye soap drifting from the open window. The widow pointed him to the barn behind the coop, where Clara was splitting logs, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, face streaked with sawdust and sweat. She turned when he approached, and James felt the world slow just a fraction. She was not beautiful in the way magazines painted, but there was something in the set of her shoulders, the way she held the axe with care rather than fear, that struck him. "I'm James Carroll," he said. "I've got a niece who lost her mother. She's quiet. Like you, I've got a place and not much more, but it's safe. I need someone to help raise her." Clara wiped her brow with the back of her hand. Her eyes, a shade of earth after rain, met his without flinching. "I don't know much about being a mother," she said. James nodded. "Neither do I about being a father." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind through the grass and the rustle of hens in the coop. Clara looked past him, toward the ridge where the light was sinking fast. "I'll come see the girl," she said finally. "If she don't take to me, I'll move on." James tipped his hat. "Fair enough." And that was how it began, not with promises, but with a shared recognition of grief and a faint flicker of something not yet named. The frost came in the night. Thin, pale sheets of it glinted across the fields as morning broke, the world holding its breath between the last rustle of autumn and the first true bite of winter. Smoke curled from the chimney of James's home by the time Clara arrived at dawn, bundled in a borrowed coat, her satchel slung across one shoulder. She didn't knock. She stood on the stoop for a moment, then pushed the door open slow, the wood groaning on its hinges. Inside, the warmth was modest, the fire banked low, the room plain and neat as a prayer. Willa sat near the hearth on a braided rug, her small back to the door, bent over a cloth doll whose button eye hung by a thread. She didn't turn. James stood at the stove, pouring black coffee into tin cups, and gave Clara a quiet nod. "She don't say much," he murmured, offering her a cup. "I understand," Clara said, though her voice was almost lost in the pop of the fire. She knelt beside Willa without fanfare, not too close, and sat on the floor as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she took off her gloves and pulled a small tin from her satchel. It clicked softly as she opened it, revealing a tiny sewing kit, needle, thread, thimble, buttons. She set it on the rug between them. "I can fix that if you want," she said, her tone calm and even. Willa didn't move, but after a few heartbeats she glanced sideways, her eyes quick and sharp, the way a stray dog might watch a stranger's hand. Then, wordless, she held out the doll. Clara took it gently, and with steady hands began the small repair. James watched from the doorway, something tight unwinding in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was, relief, maybe, or the first tremor of faith. The day passed slow and steady. Clara stayed. She mended the girl's doll, then washed a sink full of dishes without being asked. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, as though she already knew the shape of it but never assumed ownership. When she spoke, it was only when needed. Her presence was not loud, but it filled the empty corners like sunlight warming floorboards. Willa followed her with her eyes but never clung. That evening, when Clara asked where she might sleep, James showed her the spare room, his sister's old room, left untouched since the funeral. "I don't want to put you where you ain't welcome," Clara said, her voice low. James leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "This house hasn't known a woman's step in some time. Feels right somehow." Willa didn't flinch. That says more than words. Clara nodded once, and that was the end of it. Over the days that followed, something began to take root. James went out to the fields before dawn, fixing fence posts and checking the barn roof for leaks. And when he returned, he'd find fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, Willa sitting at the table drawing pictures with charcoal, Clara washing laundry at the creek. She didn't ask for much. She didn't speak of where she came from, and James didn't press. But he noticed the way she flinched when someone slammed a door too hard, or how she always kept her boots close at night. He wondered what ghost rode her shadow, but he figured it would reveal itself in time. Everyone carried something westward. The first snow came early that year, fat flakes drifting down like feathers as Clara hung linens on the line, her cheeks red from the cold. Willa watched from the porch, bundled in her shawl, and when Clara turned, she held out a hand. "Come on," she said softly. Willa hesitated, then stepped into the yard. They twirled once, then again, laughter spilling out of the child's mouth like birds breaking from a cage. James watched them from the barn, something in his chest aching sweet and strange. That night, Clara tucked Willa into bed and sang her a lullaby in a voice so soft it nearly broke the quiet. James sat by the hearth, listening, his hands curled around a mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't asked for this kind of grace. He didn't think he deserved it, but it was here, moving through the house like a new season. And though neither of them dared speak it aloud, a fragile beginning had been born, not from want or desperation, but from the quiet recognition that sometimes broken things could still be mended. The days shortened, shadows drawing long across the snow-packed fields. Winter held the land in its cold teeth, and the wind scoured everything bare. But inside the house there was warmth, low, steady, earned. The kind that came from shared silence and the soft rustle of belonging. It was not yet home, but it leaned in that direction. James spent the coldest weeks repairing the barn loft, hammering planks with red-raw hands while Clara stitched thick curtains for the windows. She did it without comment, threading patience through every seam. Willa began to speak, not often, and never loudly, but enough that James caught his breath the first time she asked for more stew. Clara never made a show of it. She asked nothing in return. But the girl began to look for her shadow in the mornings, to reach for her hand without thought. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, James would hear soft footsteps padding down the hallway as Willa crept into Clara's room just to be near her. Snow piled high against the fence posts. The road to town became near impassable, and they settled into a rhythm, the kind forged by necessity and tempered by care. Clara taught Willa how to knead bread, her hands guiding the small ones with a gentleness James hadn't known could still exist. She spoke to the girl in soft, patient tones, never asking for more than Willa could give, and never shrinking from her silences. James watched them from the doorway more often than he cared to admit. He didn't know what to make of the ache that bloomed in his chest when Clara smiled, when her laugh, rare but rich, slipped into the room like sunlight on stormy glass. It wasn't the kind of wanting he remembered from younger days. This was slower, quieter, built on something deeper than looks or need. He learned things about her in pieces. She was good with horses, knew how to check a hoof, braid a mane, said little about where she'd come from, only once mentioning Missouri in the way someone might speak of a fever they'd survived. There were scars on her arms, faint and faded, but James had seen them when she rolled up her sleeves one afternoon to haul buckets from the well. He said nothing, and she offered no explanation. That silence, too, became a form of trust. Late in January, Willa fell sick. Fever took her like a thief, and Clara didn't leave her side for 3 days. She bathed the girl in cool water, crushed herbs for tea, and sang lullabies even when her voice turned hoarse. James sat by the door most nights, helpless and haunted, watching Clara fight for the girl with a fierce tenderness that broke him open. "She'll pull through," Clara told him, one night after the child finally slept, her voice ragged but certain. "You speak it like you mean it," he said. "I have to," she answered. "She needs someone who believes she'll wake up better." In that moment, James saw her not just as a caretaker, not just as a woman who had stepped into their quiet ruin with capable hands and stayed, but as someone who had planted her roots without fanfare, who had chosen them in her way. And something in him, something long buried, stirred. Willa did get better. By the start of February, her cheeks were pink again, her laughter returned in flickers. Clara resumed her quiet routines, as though she hadn't just held death at bay with nothing more than will and care. And James began to ask himself a question he'd not dared before. Not just could she stay, but would she want to? That evening he found her outside, shoveling a path through the snow. The sky above was the color of steel, stars just beginning to wake. He stepped beside her, took the shovel from her hands without a word, and worked beside her until their breath came in clouds. "I never asked what you want," he said finally. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was low. "I want peace, I want quiet mornings, I want a place I don't have to run from." James turned to her then, shovel resting in the snow. "You could have that here," he said, "not just as Willa's caretaker, not just for the season." Clara looked at him, long and searching. "I don't know how to belong to something," she said. "You already do," he replied. She didn't speak again, but she didn't step away either. And that in its own quiet way was a beginning. By March, the thaw had begun. Ice melted in slow veins across the fields, revealing the stubborn shoots of early grass and the black, soft earth beneath. The creek behind the house ran higher each day, swollen with meltwater, and the barn smelled of damp hay and restless life. Spring came to the prairie not with fanfare, but with a steady insistence that nothing stayed buried forever. James rebuilt the chicken coop with Willa's help, her small fingers passing him nails as he hammered. Clara tended to a new garden bed, coaxing life from the soil with a kind of reverence. She planted root vegetables and herbs, and when Willa brought her a pebble shaped like a heart, she buried it beneath the rosemary with a quiet smile. They had become something of a family, unspoken, unmarked by law or name, but real all the same. At supper, Willa sat between them and leaned into Clara's side as naturally as breathing. James had begun carving a rocking chair in the evenings, more for the doing than the having, but he shaped it with care, and each curl of wood that fell to the floor felt like part of some larger promise. Clara still carried her silences like a second skin. She wandered sometimes, just to the edge of the property, standing beneath the cottonwoods with her arms crossed, her face tipped skyward. James watched from afar. He didn't follow. He'd learned that love, if that was what this might become, wasn't a net but a shelter, a place one could choose to return to without pressure or demand. One morning he found her by the creek with a letter in her lap, her shoulders bowed. She didn't hear him approach. He stopped a few paces away. "Bad news?" he asked softly. She folded the paper without looking up. "No news at all, that's the trouble." She stood brushing her skirt. Her hands trembled, and James noticed for the first time that she wore no ring, no token of any past life. Just the faded lines of old bruises, long healed but never truly gone. He wanted to ask. She saw the question in his eyes. "I left a man in Missouri," she said. "He wasn't kind. I kept waiting for someone to notice, to care. No one did, so I left, been running since. She didn't say more, but she didn't need to. The air between them thickened, not with pity, but with understanding. You're safe here, James said. I believe you, Clara replied. Her voice held no doubt. The days grew longer. Willa smiled more often now, her drawings filling the walls with crooked horses and stick-figure families that always included 3 figures, one tall, one with long hair, one small. She began calling Clara Mama without warning, and Clara froze the first time, hands wet with dishwater. James watched her close her eyes, just for a moment, and when she turned to the girl, she didn't correct her. On Sundays, they walked to the ridge and watched the sun rise, the wind lifting Clara's hair and Willa's laughter carrying on the breeze. James never reached for Clara's hand, though he wanted to. He knew she needed time. He had waited years to feel something again. He could wait a while longer. But it was Willa who bridged the distance. One evening, as James sat on the porch sharpening a blade, Clara stepped out and joined him. Willa was asleep, her doll tucked under one arm. She asked me if we were staying, Clara said quietly. James glanced up. What did you tell her? I told her yes. The knife stilled in his hands. And is that what you want? She met his eyes, something firm and bright in her gaze. It is. James said nothing for a long moment, then he set the knife aside and reached for her hand. This time, she let him. They sat in silence as the stars came out and the prairie exhaled around them. No promises were made. None were needed. The choice had been spoken in daily bread, in the mending of small dolls, in the way grief had turned not to bitterness, but to bond. Love was not a fire that consumed. It was a lamp lit at dusk, steady and sure, offering warmth in the long dark. And it had found them, after all. By April, the land turned green again. Shoots pushed up from the garden rose, the apple trees budded tentative blossoms, and the hens began laying in earnest. Life returned with a quiet vigor, and the house echoed less with loss and more with the rhythm of the living. Clara took to singing while she worked. Nothing loud, soft hymns, half-remembered lullabies, but they wrapped around the house like a shawl. Willa hummed along now and then, her voice small but sure. Sometimes she braided dandelions into Clara's hair and James would find them like small crowns as she knelt to dig potatoes or hung clothes on the line. James started building a second room off the kitchen, not because Clara asked, but because it felt right. She helped him when she could, holding boards steady or handing him tools with calloused fingers. He loved watching her hands, how capable they were, how gently they touched the world. They were hands that had built a life before, lost it, and dared to build again. One afternoon, a rider came up the path, a stranger, dust-covered and stiff from the saddle. James stepped out, wary hand resting on the post. Clara came to the porch, Willa behind her, small fingers clutching her skirt. The rider dismounted and pulled a letter from his coat. From a Reverend Ellis, said it's for a Miss Clara Green, asked me to deliver it personal. Clara stiffened. She took the envelope and turned it over, her thumb lingering on the seal. James thanked the rider and sent him on his way. Then he watched Clara as she sat on the porch steps, the letter trembling in her hands. I thought no one would come looking, she said. Is he the man you ran from? James asked, his voice careful. No, he's the man who turned me away when I begged for help. She opened the letter with slow, deliberate movements. James sat beside her, waiting. He's asking me to return, she said after a while. Says there's forgiveness in the offering, that he'll help me find respectable placement, somewhere I won't be seen as ruined. James bristled. You're not ruined. Clara gave him a wan smile. Not everyone sees it that way. What do you see? She looked out over the field, where Willa was chasing a butterfly through the tall grass. Her face softened. I see a life, she said. Not easy, but honest. I see a girl who calls me Mama, a man who doesn't need to fix me, just sees me. Then stay, James said, not out of fear, but choice. Clara folded the letter and placed it on the porch rail. The wind caught it, and she made no move to save it as it fluttered across the yard. I already did, she whispered. That night the 3 of them sat at the table, the lamp casting golden light across their faces. Willa drew a picture, 3 figures standing beneath an apple tree, a house in the distance, and a sun shining above. She handed it to Clara, who pressed it to her chest like a prayer. James took her hand beneath the table. No one spoke. There was no need. Spring crept in fully, slow, and sacred. The fields bloomed, birds returned, and laughter became a common sound within the walls. The scars Clara carried didn't vanish, but they softened, no longer sharp but part of her shape. James found himself smiling more often, even laughing when Willa tricked him with her clever games. And Clara began to look less like a woman passing through and more like one who'd been there all along. One evening, Willa asked, "Are we a real family now?" James met Clara's eyes across the table. "We always were," Clara said gently. "We just needed time to believe it." The orchard bloomed in May. Pale pink blossoms unfurled across the gnarled branches like breath returned to bone. Petals fell like whispers onto Clara's shoulders as she moved through the rows, her apron full of kindling, her steps light with purpose. Willa skipped behind her, chasing shadows and scattering bees, her laughter rising like birdsong. James watched from the porch, whittling a smooth length of cedar. The rocking chair he'd carved for Clara now sat by the window, finished and sanded to silk. He'd carved a sparrow into the top rail, a small thing, wings tucked, heart still. It hadn't meant anything at the time, but now he understood it for what it was, a promise kept. That morning Clara had braided her hair with rosemary. She did it without thinking, but when James kissed her temple and whispered, "Still planting hearts, are you?" her eyes shone with quiet joy. No declarations, no ring on her finger, but everything between them was true and chosen. They had begun to speak of next steps, not weddings or ceremonies, but practical things. A second barn, a windmill repair, a few more chickens. A new set of clothes for Willa, now that she'd outgrown her boots. Clara asked about planting lavender. James asked if she'd teach him how to make her honey biscuits. But beyond the tasks, there was a deeper settling. At night, Willa fell asleep curled between them during thunderstorms, the rhythm of their breaths forming a safe harbor. Clara woke before the others most days, and James would find her out by the porch, coffee in hand, staring out at the horizon like a woman who'd finally found ground that didn't shift beneath her feet. One evening, just as the light was beginning to fall gold across the fields, a rider came, a neighbor boy sent from town with a basket of early apples and a note from the widow Harrow. Clara greeted him with a smile, took the basket, and sent him off with a warm biscuit wrapped in cloth. Willa watched from behind her skirts, her fingers twined in the hem. "Was that boy your friend?" Clara asked after he'd gone. Willa shrugged, "Maybe." "You can have friends, you know," Clara said softly. "You don't have to stay small and quiet anymore." Willa looked up, wide-eyed. "Even if Mama died." Clara knelt beside her, brushed a curl from her cheek. "Even then, especially then, loving someone doesn't mean you stop living after they're gone." Willa nodded, then, after a moment, "I'm glad you came." Clara smiled, but her eyes filled. "Me too, little bird." Later, as stars dusted the sky and the three of them sat by the fire, James pulled something from his pocket. Not a ring, just a strip of soft, oiled leather tied with a carved button. "For your hair," he said, handing it to Clara, "or your wrist, wherever you want to keep it." She turned it over in her hands, her fingers brushing the worn knot. "What is it?" she asked. "A piece of home," he said, "so you remember it's yours too." She said nothing, just reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his. Willa leaned against her shoulder, already dozing, the fire painting their faces in flickering gold. Outside, the wind rustled the orchard, blossoms falling soft as snow. And in that small, unremarkable house at the edge of the prairie, love, slow-built, weathered, and steady, settled in for good. Not a rescue, a recognition. Not a beginning, a return. And for the first time in many years, they were not waiting for something to end. They were living something worth staying for.